Practical Apologetics for a Christian Way of Life, the Evidential Problem of Evil. In the previous video, we took an introductory look at the logical problem of evil, and we saw that atheists have struggled to substantiate the charge of a logical contradiction between the existence of evil and the existence of a God who is wholly good, omnipotent, and omniscient. As William Lane Craig comments, the atheist presupposes that God cannot have morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evil in the world. But this assumption is not necessarily true. So long as it is even possible that God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting evil, it follows that God and evil are logically consistent. As you'll see from the recommended resources, atheists continue to advance new variations of the logical problem of evil, and other philosophers continue to respond. However, the more common atheistic claim today is not that evil disproves the existence of God, but that evil grounds an evidential inference against the existence of God. In this video, we'll take a look at this evidential form of the problem of evil. So suppose someone said to you, doesn't evil make it unlikely God exists? How would you respond? You might like to press pause on the video to have a ponder. An evidential argument from evil might go something like this. 1, I don't see a good enough reason for God to do or allow X, where X stands for evil in general, or so much evil, or a particular type or example of evil. 2, if I can't see a good enough reason for God doing or allowing X, there probably isn't one. 3, therefore, there probably isn't a good enough reason for God to do or allow X. But 4, unless there's a good enough reason why God would do or allow X, God probably doesn't exist. 5, therefore, God probably doesn't exist. Now, this is a logically valid argument in that if premises 1 and 2 are true, then 3 follows. And if you add to 3, 4, and that's true, then 5 follows. So the soundness of this argument depends upon the truth of those key premises 1, 2, and 4. So let's examine them in turn. 1, I don't see a good enough reason for God to do or allow X. The project of responding to premise 1 by suggesting what reason or reasons God might plausibly have for doing or allowing X is called theodicy. There are some common themes in theodicy, such as the value of granting humans freedom to exercise morally significant choices, especially about whether to love God and or each other. The value of embodied existence, and the need for natural regularities in such a context, especially with respect to enabling morally significant choices. The value of a reality in which God offers to forgive, establish relationship with, and ultimately redeem sinful humans through the incarnation. How the Christian doctrines of heaven, the last judgment, and the establishment of the redeemed community in a new heavens and earth for eternity figure in our thinking about evil. And the fact that relationship with God is an incomparable good, one able to transform our experience of evil and suffering. For example, thinking about natural regularities, Guillermo Gonzalez and J.W. Richards point out that plate tectonics make possible the carbon cycle which is essential to our planet's habitability. In other words, you couldn't have life on Earth without earthquakes. But if you have earthquakes, that can cause suffering and death. But it's also worth pointing out that it's not so much earthquakes that kill and cause suffering, but substandard buildings caused by human greed. For example, the 2010 Haiti earthquake, which resulted in 230,000 deaths, is rather starkly contrasted with the almost identical Californian earthquake, which caused only 57 deaths. So human choices often feature in what we tend to think of as natural disasters. What about premise 2? If I can't see a good enough reason for God doing or allowing X, there probably isn't one. Is this like concluding there are no animals in the park at night because you don't see any in the limited illumination of the available lights? As William Lane Craig says, once we reflect on God's providence over the whole of history and on how seemingly insignificant events can derail the course of history with ever-widening consequences, then it becomes evident how hopeless it is for limited observers to speculate on the probability of God's lacking morally sufficient reasons for the suffering that we see. It may well be the case that only in a world involving natural and moral evil that is gratuitous with respect to producing worldly happiness, that the maximum number of people will freely come to know God and his salvation. To sustain the argument from evil here, the atheist would have to show that it's feasible for God to create a world in which the same amount of knowledge of God is achieved, but with less suffering. And as Craig says, that is sheer speculation. As William J. Wainwright says, it isn't clear that our grasp of the good we do know of is sufficiently clear to warrant assurance that those goods don't justify God's permission of horrendous evils. Nick Trakis and Eugene Nagasawa point out that parents have certain rights over their children which strangers do not. By analogy, they point out that similarly, God, in virtue of his role as our creator, may have rights over us that we do not have over each other. Thus, we have good reason to think that A, God may be morally justified in virtue of occupying this role, call it R, in permitting evil, but B, we humans cannot be morally justified in virtue of not occupying role R in permitting that evil. So arguments that make a parallel between how humans should treat one another with respect to allowing evil don't necessarily transfer over to how God should behave if they don't take into account the differences that might exist on account of God's role as our creator and the way in which that could feature into the rights that he has in this respect. A little bit like the way in which being parents gives you a unique role in respect to children that strangers, because they don't occupy that role, don't get the same kind of range of rights. As Gregory Gansel says, those who press the evidential argument against God's existence overestimate the percentage of cases in which we ought to be able to figure all of this out, and they underestimate the percentage of cases in which we actually can. What about that fourth premise? Unless there's good enough reason why God would do or allow X, God probably doesn't exist. Here we can reference philosopher Peter van Inwagen's vagueness argument. He says there is no least amount of money such that a fine in any greater amount would be an unduly severe punishment. Similarly, there is no least amount of pain such that any greater amount of pain would be too high a price to pay for widespread and significant creaturely freedom. Inwagen's metaphysical vagueness argument is that there's no precise amount of evil or suffering that must occur to secure certain compensating goods or to prevent equally bad or worse consequences. He says, God cannot remove all evil from the world now, for that would frustrate his plan for reuniting human beings with himself. And if he prevents only some evils, how shall he decide which ones to prevent? Where shall he draw the line? Wherever he draws the line, it will be an arbitrary line. That's Inwagen's key point. Wherever God draws the line, it will be an arbitrary line. To give another example that Inwagen uses, a sentence of 10 years is no more effective at deterring crime than one of 9 years and 364 days. If no gratuitous evil is ever permissible, then a just punisher wouldn't sentence the criminal to 10 years. But this argument can be reiterated ad infinitum until we conclude that no jail term is just. But surely some jail term or other is just. The solution to this paradox is to recognize that effective deterrence is vague. A perfect moral judge must simply draw a line of demarcation somewhere, and for any place he draws it, it will be true that his drawing it at a slightly different place would have been just as effective. The consequence of this metaphysical vagueness is that the reason or reasons God has for permitting evil needn't relate directly to each and every instance of evil God permits. In other words, some particular examples of evil can be gratuitous, that is, without any necessary connection to a justifying greater good, despite evil per se or as such being the necessary precondition of a justifying good or set of justifying goods. In sum, premises 1, 2, and 4 of the evidential argument are all questionable. Atheist philosopher Michael Tooley admits that the evidential argument from evil is highly controversial. He says, even if it can be shown that the evils that are found in the world render the existence of God unlikely, it might still be the case that the existence of God is not unlikely, all things considered. For perhaps the argument from evil can be overcome by appealing either to positive arguments in support of the existence of God, or to the idea that belief in the existence of God is properly basic. Alvin Plantinga gives the example of someone who's accused of a crime and against whom all the evidence stands, even though that person knows he's innocent. In such a case, that person is not necessarily obliged to abandon belief in his own innocence. The properly basic belief that he did not commit the crime intrinsically defeats the defeaters brought against it by the evidence. Plantinga makes the theological application by suggesting that belief in God may similarly be intrinsically defeating of some defeaters that might be brought against it. Now, there might be a point in such a court case when the person on trial, even though they remember being someone else at the time when the crime was supposed to be committed, and thus they have a properly basic belief founded in their memory that they are innocent, there might come a time when so much evidence is brought against them that they are obliged to abandon belief in their own innocence. They might have to form the belief that maybe they've been hypnotized into having a false belief about where they were at the time of the crime or something like that. But certainly their properly basic belief in their innocence could soak up a lot of evidence brought against them. Daniel Howard Snyder points out that suppose you learn that 95% of the French population can't swim. Now, that statistic is some evidence to think that Pierre, your friend from Paris, can't swim. Does it follow that you should believe Pierre can't swim? Well, of course not. What if you and Pierre spent last Saturday afternoon together swimming? Your experience with him is much better evidence to think he can swim, even though the statistical evidence by itself makes it very likely that he cannot. So we have to think here about the balance of evidence. In one balance pan, as it were, we have the evidential argument from evil, and in the other balance pan, we might have properly basic religious belief. We might also have many other arguments that make a cumulative case for theism. It's perhaps particularly worth pointing out moral arguments in this context. As Stephen E. Parish says, the existence of evil is dependent upon an objective, necessarily true ethical system, which theism can sustain much more plausibly than can naturalism. Now, when I mentioned the moral argument for God in the video on the logical problem of evil, I noted that the argument doesn't directly say anything about God being omnipotent or omniscient as well as wholly good. However, one might think one or more versions of the cosmological argument provides grounds for thinking God is omnipotent. And one might think that an omnipotent person would be able to know anything it is logically possible to know. Let me end with a thought from English writer Dorothy L. Sayers, which brings in a point of the Christian gospel and applies it to the problem of suffering and evil. Sayers writes that for whatever reason God chose to make man subject to sorrows and death, he had the honesty and the courage to take his own medicine. He was born in poverty and died in disgrace and felt it worthwhile. So think back to the questioner asking, doesn't evil make it unlikely God exists? How would you respond now?